The books of Marquis de Sade are some of the most violent and gruesome around. The books are banned in many countries, and it's no surprise. It's not a mystery why. They're filled with like abuse. They seem to glorify abuse and mostly sexual abuse, sexual violence, fetishism. The word sadism comes from Sade's name. So here's the question that I want to think about. Why does he exist? Why do these books exist? What do they speak to historically? What do they say about human beings? I don't think it's always possible to answer these kinds of questions, and it's certainly not possible to answer them in any kind of conclusive way or expansive kind of way. But there's an interesting answer given by Michel Foucault in his History of Sexuality, where he addresses this very issue, this very topic. So, who is Michel Foucault? Foucault is a moral relativist. That means he's very interested in understanding and thinking about the ways in which morality differs between different societies, or the way morality has changed over history. According to Michel Foucault, morality is context sensitive. That means that morality emerges from the context in which it is, specifically from the power structures of a particular society, from the way that society is organized. And so for Foucault, when the power structures of a society changes, or when a society is organized differently, we would expect the morality of that society to change. For Foucault, morality is like this kind of collective subconscious. It's like this collective sense of revulsion that people in a society share, which is helpful in maintaining the stability of that society, the success of that society, and very often it's helpful in perpetuating the organization of that society. So before the Enlightenment, pre-Enlightenment societies were governed by a dictator, by a monarch who had absolute power. And laws came down from this monarch. And the rule of law was enforced by the threat of violence of the sovereign, of the dictator. Dictators have the power to execute whoever they determine to be rebellious. They can even torture their subjects if they want to. In these societies, power is synonymous with violence. To be the king is to be the most powerful. It's to be the most violent. And so, according to Foucault, in these societies, there is this fascination, there's this fixation on this question of violence. When is violence permitted? Who is allowed to use violence? Violence in these societies, force, is in many ways the biggest temptation. It's the most egregious sin. It could be justified, it could be abhorred, it's sometimes romanticized. Foucault calls these societies societies of blood. Foucault writes, quote, "The blood relation long remained an important element in the mechanisms of power, its manifestations and its rituals. For a society in which the system of alliance, the political form of the sovereign, the differentiation into orders and castes, and the value of descent lines were predominant. For a society in which famine, epidemics, and violence made death imminent, blood constituted one of the fundamental values. It owed its high value at the same time to its instrumental role, the ability to shed blood, to the way it functioned in the order of signs, to have a certain blood, to be of the same blood, to be prepared to risk one's blood, and also to its precariousness, easily spilled, subject to drying up, too readily mixed, capable of being corrupted. A society of blood, where power spoke through blood, the honor of war, the fear of famine, the triumph of death, the sovereign with his sword, executioners and tortures. Blood was a reality with a symbolic function." End quote. A literary example of this society of blood dynamic can be found in Shakespeare's Macbeth. In the beginning of the play, we're introduced to Macbeth, and we get a sense of why he's such a powerful and important character. Quote, "For brave Macbeth, well he deserves that name, disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution, like valor's minion, carved out his passage till he faced the slave, which never shook hands nor bade farewell to him, till he unseamed him from the nave to the chaps, and fixed his head upon our battlements. End quote. So we're told that what makes Macbeth great and what makes him an important political figure who deserves his political power is the fact he can chop a person in half in battle. In the play, Macbeth gets convinced by his wife, Lady Macbeth, to kill the king, King Duncan, when the king is staying with the Macbeths in their castle. Because in this world, power is earned through violence, through force. There's something horrendous and horrific and abhorrent about killing the king. It's obviously the worst crime, but it's also the crime that ultimately justifies, more than anything else, the ability to sit on the throne in this society of blood. In a dramatic scene, Macbeth wavers in his resolve to commit this crime, to commit this act, and Lady Macbeth convinces him to do it. After Lady Macbeth manages to convince Macbeth to go forward with this murder, he says, quote, "Bring forth men children only, for thy undaunted mettle should compose nothing but males." End quote. In the society of blood, manliness is about the capacity for violence, the capacity to be undaunted in the face of blood. Eventually, after the murder, Lady Macbeth becomes consumed by guilt for what she did. She ends up trying to constantly wash the blood from her hands. She can't get the blood off her hands. And in that image of Lady Macbeth washing her hands, you sort of get the central paradox, this ultimate mystery of the society of blood, this temptation versus the ultimate crime of murder. In more modern societies, in democratic societies, in capitalist societies, power is distributed very differently. Instead of being the subjects of a single sovereign, a single monarch, power is distributed among a large class of people. You might call these the capitalist class, the capitalists. They're people who own most of the wealth. They own the corporations. You might think of them as the elites more broadly, the political elites, the people who donate to political campaigns, the people who attend fundraisers together and marry each other's children. In modern society, power is expressed by who are the people you associate with, who your parents are, what schools you go to, what parties you attend. According to Foucault, these kind of societies are societies of sex. Quote, "We, on the other hand, are in a society of sex, or rather a society with a sexuality. The mechanisms of power are addressed to the body, to life, to what causes it to proliferate, to what reinforces the species, its stamina, its ability to dominate, or its capacity for being used. Through the themes of health, progeny, race, the future of the species, the vitality of the social body, power spoke of sexuality and to sexuality." In our modern societies, sex is the ultimate question, the ultimate enigma. Who you can and cannot have sex with, who you should have sex with. It's the most tempting of sins in our society. It's something that we simultaneously repress and something that we simultaneously parade around and wear with pride. When I think about sex as the symbol of power in the modern world, I think about Donald Trump and his owning the Miss America pageant. I think of Donald Trump's grab them by the pussy comment. I think of Jeffrey Epstein, who was arrested for sex trafficking, as like the symbol of the ultimate excess of power in America. Sex education is a political question, and the art and the literature of the contemporary modern world is filled with the consequences of sex, what happens when you do or don't choose to have sex. And so a question that Foucault asks, which is worth thinking about, is when did this transition take place? When was the move from a society of blood to a society of sex? And so Foucault would say that the Enlightenment, and then specifically the French Revolution, which is sort of this moment in time that really brought about a cascading effect of democracy into Europe, which moved us away from the rule of a single monarch to a much more democratic, capitalist kind of system. Foucault would say that was the moment of transition. Marquis de Sade is an interesting character because that was the moment in which he lived. He was involved in the French Revolution. He was a nobleman of the old world, but he also at times was a revolutionary. He had a foot in each world. And so Sade is sort of at the center of this Venn diagram. He's this turning point in history. And his work seems to reflect a overlap of those two moralities. The opulence and the excess and the transgressions of blood, which is violence and torture, and the excess and the opulence of a society of sex, which is sexual gratification and pleasure.